Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. I have this great privilege every week of introducing to you men and women who were drawn to the fullness of the Catholic Church. Sometimes our guests are folk that come from backgrounds in which they had no interest in the church at all, maybe even little knowledge in the church. Others are what we call reverts, for want of a better term. They were brought up Catholic, maybe at different levels of information, but after a time away, discovered their way home. And such is our guest tonight, Dr. Anthony Caruso. And Dr. Caruso, I welcome you to The Journey Home.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
And in our little previous discussion, it sounds like we crossed paths unexpectedly.
That's true.
Back about 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. But it's great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
And if you've seen the program, you know that generally what I invite the guest to do is to take a long step back and give the audience a glimpse of your early spiritual journey, if you would.
Well, thank you, Marcus. I mean, Boston is a very big part of my life. I was born actually in Bangor, Maine, and spent 10 days there, and then grew up in the Dorchester part of Boston, and attended Catholic schools, and had a wonderful Catholic family. I'm a third-generation Italian. My grandfather came from Italy. My mother is pure Irish, and they actually lived across the street from each other as they grew up, and actually met then, so they knew each other forever. But in the fourth grade, I got a visit from this gentleman, and who asked us all to come down and sing for him, and what I did, I sang the national anthem, and next thing I knew, I was going to this strange place in Cambridge called St. Paul's, and joined a choir school, which really kind of opened my mind up to a certain level of people.
Maybe tell the audience what is a choir school.
Oh, yes. The St. Paul's has a choir school that was established in 1963 by Theodore Maria, and he has built it in the design of the choir schools in Europe. So you all went to school together. You didn't live, it wasn't a dormitory, but you sang at the 8 o'clock Mass every morning, Sunday liturgies, do a combination of English, Latin, chants, things like that. Got involved in all the major celebrations of St. Paul's. Now, St. Paul's in Cambridge is the Catholic parish of Harvard University. Okay. So you would also get some of those people involved, and we got to sing throughout the entire New England area. I mean, at 10 years old, I was in a group that stood on the stage of Symphony Hall with Sergio's Hour, Michael Tilson Thomas, singing all these different wonderful things in classical music, and we trained in piano and voice and all that stuff. And we didn't have the church like thrown at us, but we did fight with each other to see who would be the thurifer and who would be the master of ceremonies and who would be the acolytes during that time. And it was a great beginning grounding in the faith. Mr. Mario was one of my true mentors in life and all kinds of things. And so from there...
Well, let's pause there, 'cause if I could ask, what time period was this?
This was from 1973 to 1977.
Okay, so the mid-70s. An interesting time in the church after the council. So it sounds like you're going to a school that is still celebrating the traditional chanting high mass. That's what you were getting at a time when all of that was kind of an upheaval in our
You're right. Well, it wasn't the kind of chanting that you would find as part of the usual daily mass stuff. It was usually a kind of a special thing we did. Maybe once or twice a month, the schola would do one of the sequences. They would do a part of the mass, but it wasn't a chanted mass in that sense. Good. It was really based. As a matter of fact, they wrote a special hymnal called Hymn, Psalms, and Spiritual Canticles that they utilized that kind of mixed the good and from the old to some of the new and maintained some of the old hymn lines along that way. And we did at that time still sing all the masses in terms of the readings for the Easter Vigil, and there was a mixture of different things, but the masses were in English. There was still all those things there, and I never really knew a time.
This wouldn't have been
after that kind of stuff before that until my later times. But for what I kind of figured, it gave me a very good grounding in what we understood at that time as the Catholic faith, and very holy people helping us out through the way. And we got to see, because we didn't sing just in Catholic churches, we sang in Protestant churches and synagogues and secular places. And so we got to see a little bit of, we didn't understand what it was, but at the time we saw there were differences amongst people.
Would you say in that school, which was a Catholic choir school, was there a good catechetical foundation for you?
It was, in the sense, as I look back. I mean, we did go right into the Bible. We would study Acts of the Apostles. We would study things from a standpoint. Most of the catechetical training was from priests in the parish that actually came in and taught the classes and all that stuff. But there was enough of a smattering of, God is love and we love each other and let's all do this together. And
that was a strong macrame period.
Exactly, exactly. And it was actually done within the framework of the whole line. I mean, I think that Mr. Maria came from the old church too, so he had a really keen sense of the sacred. So he would try to imbue that as any person would to a bunch of kids between 10 and 14 years old could. But it was a very special time in my life.
All right.
But when we graduated from there and we went on to Boston College High School, that was my first Jesuit type of training, which was excellent in terms of
Boston College High School. So it's associated with Boston College?
Yeah, well, it is, but it's not on the same campus. It's in Dorchester, and they really run separate entities, so to speak. Right. And that's where the catechetical structure sort of began to fall to the wayside. We weren't getting the same sort of church teaching. We were never really given the catechism per se. It was a lot of feeling, a lot of social justice, a lot of bread for the world, which is fine, and a lot of things. And a focus on service, which was an excellent way to get into the environment, but not a whole lot of teaching behind it. Yep. And I sort of, even college, where I went again to a Jesuit university, Fairfield, and that was the first time I sat in a class and was basically told in theology that I had to look at it as if we created the religion, and that God was a creation of the world and not the other way around, which I had a real problem with. But over time, in order to do well in the class, I kind of stayed on script and started talking and thinking about it that way, but not necessarily. I was active in campus ministry. I was doing all those things, but still was very active in other Christian types of denominations, and actually was asked more than once to leave the Catholic Church and join the Assemblies of God Church or other Protestant factors, and always at that time felt like I really couldn't walk away from my Catholic faith, such as it was. But
if you look back, Dr. Caruso, to that time in your life, where would you say, with hindsight, your personal faith was?
It was about as good as you could expect without thinking about some of the social implications of what you were thinking about. I mean, I do not remember a time when I did not believe that the Christ wasn't centered in the Eucharist. I did fall away from the confessional because it didn't seem as important at the time. I started to take on a little bit more of an idea that if I was sorry for something and I just said I was sorry, that somehow I was forgiven along that way, and fell away from that perspective, and would have I remember even as a 21-year-old saying that I have respectful disagreements with certain things within the Catholic Church, and I thought that was okay, and
mature.
So I was maturing in that line, and we could live together along those lines. I mean, we wanted to go to medical school. I didn't get into medical school immediately, and wound up getting a degree in public health while I was teaching school. And even there, because more of an international focus, because I was doing environmental epidemiology. We were looking at things like the Framingham Heart Study at the time. It was coming through Boston University, and looking at all those different things. And that kind of brought the more secular world in, because I was beginning to see some of the benefits of that, and pushing me more towards, if I have this and I have this, then I guess I can be happy along those ways. I mean, it was all building towards making a grand attempt to get into medical school, which I eventually did.
But just one other thing before we move on, because our Pope Benedict has written recently in one of his letters or encyclicals called, I think, The Word of God, encouraging Catholics to read their Bibles more often so that they might have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So we have a Holy Father that's encouraging that which was maybe more common to hear amongst our evangelical brothers. If you look back, you were good at going to Mass and maybe not, but between you and God, your own personal prayer life, would you have looked back at that time, that was a big part of your life? Yeah.
Well, off and on, I would have times that I would be looking at that. I mean, the title of my Bible I walked through from high school to college was the Good News Bible.
Yep.
So I mean, that's, we could think about where that goes now. Looking back on it, seems kind of almost funny. But but looking at it from that perspective and just learning and trying to pray from the perspective of that which I was being directed to by the people I saw who were brothers and priests in the faith and within the campus ministry team. And I would have times where I would think I had a very personal life with God, where I could call on Him and things like that. Back in college, the big issues were things like the nuclear freeze issue, and that was a time when we were all worried about the possibilities of a nuclear holocaust between us and Russia, and so there was all those kind of things going. We would pray along those lines. But in terms of a personal relationship with Christ, I felt close to Christ. But
especially still in the Eucharist. You recognize
especially still in the Eucharist, I always saw that. Even though if I didn't get to Mass every week when I left college. I mean, in college, we felt a need to go to college every Sunday to Mass. And we tended to do it at 10:30 at night in the dormitory with the priests who lived in the dorms with us. And so there was no tabernacle or things like that. But there was no question that I and my friends, no matter what we did when we weren't in church, when we were in church, we knew that what we were receiving was the body of Christ.
Yeah. All right. So medical school. So that does what you're saying. I mean, that opens for you. You've gotten involved in ecumenical things, right? You're involved with the general health, social environment of the time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I was. And my great aunt, my mother's aunt Betty, who was a person who worked for Social Security for years, gave me advice that when you get into a bad place, the only way you would have any kind of community with anybody else is if you found a group of Catholics. So I joined the local Catholic church when I got to medical school, and I actually started directing music there. Did that for a year with my roommate, who was also doing the same thing, and got to meet some of those people along that lines while I was doing my medical studies. Now, the initial parts of medical school are not necessarily faith and religion and all that kind of stuff. It's anatomy and physiology and that stuff. So really it wasn't so much of a theological sense in there, or God wasn't necessarily mentioned in there. And as you get more into medicine, you begin to see the magic that we can perform in medicine. And it's not too far away from believing at that time that, God's a part, but not the major part.
When I was in grad school studying molecular biology, the professor specifically told me that one of his goals was to discourage his students to believe in God. Because I was at a second university, and because he had come from a very faith background, but had come out of it.
Right.
And now part of his medical training was to convince people that you can look at all of this without seeing God behind it. Was any of that a part of your training?
Not overtly, but you could see that the explosion in molecular biology that was happening when I was in college was playing forth in medical school, in the sense that what we saw in medical school is that intense thing that look at the wonders that science has done. And not that God wasn't mentioned, but he wasn't mentioned. I was never told he didn't exist, but he wasn't a major part of it. And we didn't really have a centralized thought. You didn't really see God in everything you did. And while it did to a certain extent push me in the direction that I went into. I mean, I went into obstetrics and gynecology because I enjoyed taking care of women, and I saw it as a wonderful mix of medicine and surgery, and I loved the babies and all that stuff. I met a wonderful woman and married her the day after I graduated from medical school, and she was in the church too, and it was kind of this all in it together, moving towards some form of life where we knew we were socially Catholic in the sense that we had this kind of mixture with whatever, but it didn't really feed back to a central the central theological core in the sense we didn't have a central pull. The church wasn't the centerpiece of the life. It was trying to work within the outskirts of that in the social scene. And that you begin to fall away from some of the central things and become more of what you would call a
So
Catholic
through medical
Catholics.
school, you meet your wife, you're still involved with the church then?
Well, actually, no.
Okay.
As I started to go through my third and fourth years, I started to really begin to question things. And I actually started to attend a non-denominational church for a time, and met people there and liked them all. And I thought the way they did communion was a little strange, but what we went for was the sermons were fabulous, and the music was fabulous, and you could listen to all that stuff. And for probably the better part of a year, I didn't go to a Catholic Mass at all. This was before I met my wife. Because I was just seeking for something that I wasn't finding when I was going to church.
Yeah, yeah. Were you, as a result of your medical school, was there an awareness of the Catholic teachings on the medical issues at all at this time?
Not really. There were some ethics classes that we took at the time, and they were based on some sort of general natural law. But no one ever said that these are uniquely Catholic thoughts. As a matter of fact, that was part of my confusion, is that we just never really were talking about Catholic things. And it was almost like it was truly ecumenical in the sense that all churches were the same. So it didn't really matter which church you were in. As long as you did something on Sunday to worship God, you were okay. So you have to look at that. Although, when I met my wife because I was a friend of the youth minister at the church I used to work at, and I was going out for a drink with her for some day, and she brought this other woman with her, and I didn't know why she had her with her, and it turns out she didn't want to be there because she thought she was honing in on a date between me and my friend. And not to make a long story short, we wound up, that was how we met, and that's how we got together, and ultimately fell in love and got married.
She was active in the church?
She was actually
bring you back a bit?
Well, yeah, she was a pastoral associate at one of the local parishes, one of the youngest ones in the Archdiocese of Chicago at the time, doing youth ministry for the church. She had gone to college and did pastoral ministry there. She had actually almost become a nun at one point, and she decided that she didn't want that, and she's she's a wonderful woman. But the thing is that when we fell in love and all that kind of stuff, we first were going to push off the wedding, and then we decided we were going to get married the day after I graduated from medical school. And so I had this great, huge weekend when we graduated from medical school, went to baccalaureate mass, and pulled all those kind of things. And what Barb did for me was she pulled me a little bit back into the church, but not fully back in the church in the sense that we were going to church more, we were going to Catholic church more, but we weren't exactly being fully imbued in the church. We were seeing that just going into Mass and receiving communion and doing that stuff were the things. And as we got closer to the wedding, we started to go to Mass more. And we wrote our own vows, and we did everything along that line, and we still have the tape of the wedding, which I look at sometimes. And it was a really great classical wedding. The priest was a good friend of ours, and it was a really wonderful time. And we certainly took it seriously from that perspective of a sacrament. But it was that piece of that one piece was probably the one piece out there that we said, okay, we're Catholic.
Yeah.
But other than that, I couldn't really have told you at that time all the things of what it meant.
Yeah, I was going to say, was there any connection between your work as a doctor and your Catholic faith on a Sunday morning?
Well, not then it wasn't.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I went, when I did my first year of residency, we went to New York, and it was in a county hospital along East Meadow, New York, and we lived on campus. There were lots of things going on there, but one of the big things that really kind of come against us is no matter what we did in terms of Catholic faith, we always knew that there was something with terminations or abortion that was wrong. And I was going to be not forced, but encouraged to do a rotation in family planning in my second year. And that plus some of the things that were going on that we saw in the line that we had, we made a determination we had to leave there for that reason. So we moved from New York.
You were already aware of... In your medical training, had you been trained
No.
to do these procedures?
No. No, I hadn't been, and that's the great secret in obstetrics is that most OBs have not been trained in the termination technique. So I wasn't trained in medical school. I never saw it in medical school because it was a Catholic medical school.
Okay.
But we left and went to Springfield where I finished my residency, and they didn't do terminations there, and it was all that part of it. And I had such a wonderful time my second year that I had all the oysters at my feet. I could have gone into maternal fetal medicine or oncology or reproduction, and ultimately determined myself that I really loved the idea of helping people build families. So I decided to go into reproductive endocrinology, and was fortunate enough to rotate in a place that would take me as a fellow, and had 2 wonderful years in Chicago learning about all the vagaries of infertility and how to treat it.
Okay. During this time, you and your family are active in your church?
Yes and no. I mean, we were. I mean, in the sense that we had our first child, my oldest child, when we were in Springfield, and she was baptized in our local church, which we got to as often as we could. And she was actually baptized within the actual framework of a Sunday Mass. So it was, I suppose, that again makes us, along that way Catholic. And my wife was the chairman of the theology department of the local high school. So I suppose that makes us from that Catholic. And again, we saw Catholicity as going to Mass and receiving communion. That was being Catholic. And
you wouldn't have called yourself a cafeteria Catholic, would you?
I would have.
Or would you? That's what I'm wondering. How far you would define yourself?
Well, I would call myself a Catholic who respectfully disagreed with some of the teachings of the Catholic Church, and we would seek into things of why to try to justify what it was that we could do and couldn't do along that way, and especially as we got into the line of the reproduction side, I really didn't see what the problem was. Because I mean, we were helping people come in, we were helping people have families. It was all good, and my mentor there was a Polish Catholic who she was really understood some of the things and disagreed, and that's how we wound up going through and justifying everything we did, was because the people were having something they couldn't have before.
You're in Springfield. It sounds like you're not being asked to do terminations.
No, I wasn't asked to do terminations.
Were there other things going on that you were doing that, with hindsight, you look back, were not in line with the teachings of the church?
we were doing pretty routinely. We were doing tubal ligations and things like that, and I could definitely see that, and found about 30 different ways to prescribe contraception, and we saw the benefits in that, in terms of that stuff. We always argued that people were having kids and they didn't want to have children anymore, and so they had they had the tubes tied so they couldn't get pregnant anymore, and it was pretty straightforward as a day surgery that it could be done, and and contraception. I mean, you would write contraception for people and put it under the guise of things like, bleeding problems or whatever, things go along that way. So, and you never thought twice about those things. It was just out there because you didn't realize that there would be some sort of thing. I mean, and the residency was not within the guise of a Catholic church. It was a secular residency. But there was no reason to think that for any reason that there'd be any concerns with that.
But I'd also probably say that on your daily, weekly, faithful attendance at Mass,
Mm-hmm.
you were probably not being verbally challenged.
Oh no, never. For years I was never done that. Even when I finished my fellowship and got out there and was practicing in private practice and all that kind of stuff, I was actively involved in my parish. I was on the pastoral council of the parish. I was in the school boards in the parish. If parishes I was involved, and I was a prominent member. We were never backseat Catholics in terms of the activities within our parishes. Once I got out and we started having kids and got along that way, and as a matter of fact, everyone kind of knew what I did, but nobody would ever kind of come up to me and say, "Have you ever thought about what it is that you did?" Until
Did you ever hear a homily against it?
Do I have my homily?
Did you ever hear a homily during
Oh gosh,
military?
no, never.
So never from the pulpit are you being challenged? You're not hearing statements against this activity?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, it was, you would hear your annual or semi-annual discussion about abortion. That was, yes, we always knew that was wrong, and I always felt that was wrong. It was terminating a life that had already been established, and all that's fine. I think that's okay, and we would talk about that, but that was pretty much the only thing that was ever talked about.
Yeah.
But it changed a few years into what I was doing.
Are we ready to pause there at this point?
You can pause there at this point.
This is probably a good point, because I think you're defining in many ways a lot of Catholics. You do the things, you do the externals, but it hasn't really happened in here yet.
No.
Nor has it confronted issues you're doing in your everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something we need to hear, because there needs to be a direct connect between those things. Let's pause there then. All right, Dr. Caruso. Let's pause, and we'll come back in a moment and hear the issues that awakened his heart to being a deeper, committed Catholic, both at home as well as at work, right? Mm-hmm. See you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host. Our guest tonight is Dr. Anthony Caruso from Chicago. What kind of doctor?
I'm what they call a reproductive endocrinologist.
Okay, all right. And so at the stage at which we've interrupted your journey, are you then, now you've got your own practice?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well, I was working with one of the larger groups in the city of Chicago. I had a great partner who was Israeli, and we'd talk about all kinds of issues at all kinds of times of the day and things like that. And I had a group of women who were engaged in same-sex, not marriage at the time, they were mostly living together, that wanted to have children, and we would help them along the way. And the Chicago Tribune called, and they wanted to interview me, and they asked me about those people. And I said, they're just like everybody else. And today I would tell you the same thing. I mean, they're children of God. They're just like everybody else. Well, that got published, and I got a phone call from my pastor, and he asked me to come in and see him. And he had the article, he asked me about it. He asked me if I really said that. I said yes, and we talked about the issue a little bit. And that was the first time somebody at that level had ever kind of hinted that what I was doing was not in line with Catholic teaching. And I was gently asked to not renew my time on the pastoral council and the school board, which those times were coming up anyway. But I walked away from that, and I wish I could tell you that I ran to my wife and said, "Well, we're leaving the field." No, I didn't do that then. I kind of walked away, not angry, but thinking, "Wow, this is unusual." And my wife at this time had begun to think about and got herself into the job she's in now, teaching at a Catholic high school in where we live. And we would go to functions with a couple of the members of the department, and we'd have these open debates about infertility, and they'd bring up Donum Vitae, and they'd bring up Humanae Vitae, and they'd bring up those things, and we'd have these great discussions about it, because I saw the Donum Vitae only had one line about it, so I didn't know how big they really thought about it. Yeah. And more importantly, the father of IVF, Howard Jones, was celebrating one of his big birthdays, and we went to a conference, and he got up and he told his story about his involvement in the development of Donum Vitae. And he would say to you, and actually wrote it down, he published it, that he believed that the time that they talked to the people who were in the building at the time, that they were going to allow these procedures in the Catholic Church. And he was amazed and astounded when the Catholic Church wrote Donum Vitae, which basically said no. And how could the Catholic Church have done this when their people were voting for it and all that stuff? And I took that banner proudly and said, they're making all these wild accusations of what could happen to embryos. And I really did believe that Donum Vitae was really trying to make a science fiction and all that kind of stuff. But
for the audience, Donum Vitae is a statement of the church on these issues, giving the church's position.
Right. It's the church's position on artificial reproduction and in vitro fertilization and things like that. But it had more to do with the disposition of the embryo than anything else. What could and should not be done, should not be done with embryos and things like that to a certain extent. And I kept on doing what I was doing. And then my wife was on the trip with her students, the summer trips to Europe, and wound up in Rome. And went to, I think, the St. Mary Major or someplace else, went to confession for the first time in 20 years. It came back somewhat changed. And we had life events that happened afterwards in terms of her losing her parents. And things were moving along that line. But we started to be a little bit more open to what the Catholic Church was teaching. Again, searching for some sort of meaning, I think. And we thought to ourselves, what are we going to do next? And this person who I had been debating all these times recommended that we give some consideration to going out to his church, which is in the city of Chicago. Around that same time, though, the church came out with its most recent document that's called Dignitas Personae. Yeah. And I read it out of a newspaper, and I was astounded by it because the Cardinal of Avada had made all the right recommendations, right assumptions. He assumed a good pregnancy rate. He assumed that we were doing everything to try to preserve embryos. And yet he very detailed and very cleanly and beautifully discussed why it was wrong. And at that point in time, life pretty much changed. I started to see the embryos in the freezer as potential abortions. I kind of started to see a lot more of the problems we were having. People were losing embryos sometimes. And then the whole idea of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis started to come in, and we started to screen embryos for Down syndrome and Huntington's chorea and things like that. And we were transferring the embryos that were unaffected, but we were destroying the embryos that were affected or indeterminate. And I thought, there's something not right about this. It makes no sense. And then I started to see in my position more and more of the people coming through with alternative lifestyles, single people with surrogates, same-sex people, going and making demands that were beyond the usual that we would see. And then finally I started seeing people coming who were getting their people from other countries. So now we were going to save money. We're going to get the surrogate from India or someplace else, or the egg donor from someplace in Europe, or we don't have to pay them quite so much money, and kind of go along that way. And I was wrestling with these when I started to go to this church, St. John Cantius in the city of Chicago. And my wife had gone to their lessons and carols, and she came back thinking we have to kind of take a closer look at this church. And so I went for morning mass, and it was Tridentine. And I really only went to one or two Tridentine masses in my life. And I knelt down, I closed my eyes, for some reason, I started to envision my time back at St. Paul's as a child. And I thought, this is kind of fun. Let's go back and do this again. So we started going again and again and again. And my wife had gone to a confession with the pastor of the church, Father Phillips. And so then I went to another one of the priests there, Father Bart, and we started to go on this longitudinal discussion of all the issues that were there and the actual wrestling I was having inside my soul about getting out of the field and what was wrong with it and how are we going to make this right. And I started talking to some people in different parishes, and my wife communicated with the cardinal and with our local bishop, and we got some encouragement from the chanceries, and then I met the Respect Life coordinators of Chicago, and she was very open and honest and very supportive of me and trying to get out of the field. And then they assigned me with Father Grogan, who was the liaison between the Archdiocese of Chicago and the healthcare, and we put together this kind of executive thing to put together a new center that would allow people to get fertility treatment without the advanced technologies within the guidelines of the Catholic Church, and presented that plan to every one of the Catholic hospitals in Chicago. At the same time, I was being interviewed to be the head of reproductive medicine at Loyola, my medical school, and I didn't get that job. But the thing, all these things kind of worked along that way, and everybody said the same thing, that they loved the idea, but they didn't have any money, and so they couldn't really pull it together, whatever. So then Magic really is a result of several things: the downturn in the economy, the fact that the university started to have a huge deficit, that they were cutting back on things, there was some goofiness going on in some of the regulatory stuff. My department, at this time I was in the faculty at the University of Chicago. The department had to get smaller, and I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and they pulled me in, and they told me that they had to cut me because I was pretty much the last in, first out. And when they did that, I thought to myself, wow, God really does do things, because I didn't know how I was going to get out of this. Now I've been pushed. So I think they were a little surprised I wasn't more upset. But I was like, okay, and they thought I was in shock. And I'm thinking to myself, I wasn't shocked, because I thought to myself, wow, this is amazing. So I had to find a job. And I found the job at being a hospitalist at one of the Catholic hospitals in Chicago. And
What's that?
What it basically means is that I walked out of my field and into the field of obstetrics. And I was actually talking to the physician recruiter about joining a practice, and told him what my requirements were: that I wouldn't write contraception, I wouldn't do sterilizations, I wouldn't do IVF, I wouldn't do inseminations. I was just going to do Catholic things. And they couldn't find a practice that would work with me. And
which is kind of bizarre.
Yeah,
in itself.
And that kind of stuff. But they did have this position. The hospital had a couple of major lawsuits, and they wanted to have somebody in there during the day to try to prevent more problems and try to increase the safety of the unit and stuff like that. So that was the job I wound up in. And that part works out okay, but I also got to be one of the primary teachers for 4 medical students every 6 weeks, and I just love that. So it's just an amazing line. And for about a year and a half, I did that without really anything, very quietly. And then the HHS mandate hit.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, I was out there, because I got a phone call. This group of people that I started getting involved with at St. John's were the most wholesome, wonderful people I've ever met in my life, and we became good friends with a number of people. And I didn't realize fully was that some of those people were actively involved in the pro-life movement and things like that. And I got a phone call from the Pro-Life Action Committee and asked to be a speaker at the first of the speak out rallies for the religious freedom. And I said, okay. and so I took a day off and went down to Federal Plaza and was one of the medical guys, and can't really tell you what I said because I don't remember. But the thing is that the funny part about that was the Federal Plaza cut the power to the day, so we all had to speak through a bullhorn. Which was fabulous.
Like the old days.
Like the old days, and nobody could hear us, and but it was fun because you looked out on this square, and it was filled with a sea of people who were just all part of that, and I knew that things were moving. At the same time, one of the parishes in one of the western suburbs of Chicago called me because there was a plan to build a big IVF center a block away from the church, and they were going to fight it. They wanted to be their medical resident expert, and so I went out there and testified with them, and I think we changed a couple of hearts, but ultimately it was approved. And as a part of that, though, the pastor wanted me to try to help to educate some of his parishioners. So I started to put together a group of talks called the Commodification of Life, and started to talk there, and then slowly but surely other people started asking me to talk, and so then I've been doing this kind of speaking series all through the Chicagoland area about contraception and IVF and all these things, and the Catholic position on it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to back up a little bit.
Sure, that's fine.
Because you read this new document.
Mm-hmm.
Was kind of the change,
mm-hmm.
right? Talk about that. It was a moment of grace, as Newman would put it, that it wasn't merely an intellectual reading of these words that changed you, that it was a work of God's grace to touch your life?
Well, I think that was one of those moments of grace. I wish I could tell you that it was like a Pauline experience, that,
Right.
The light blinded me and I knew that it was Christ. And that wasn't like that. There were other things going on. My wife had already sent the letters out to the cardinal, and I knew that because the cardinal was on my voicemail one night saying she got our letter, which I thought was kind of funny. But the thing is that it was all that, and I think I was ripened for God's grace. There were things that were happening that underlies, and maybe it even goes back as far as that discussion with the priest, 6-7 years before, that all of a sudden this came out, and it took me more than one reading. I just couldn't believe what I was reading, and kind of went along the way. And then all of a sudden, as I started to go back and look at other things, they all started to make sense. So from that perspective, I knew that something was wrong, and how much I was probably not doing God's work because how I would used to try to deal with it in the days leading up to this is I started praying as I was doing my procedures. I would say Hail Marys as I was doing embryo transfers, and Our Fathers as I was doing egg retrievals and things like that, thinking to myself, okay, this is how I can get around this. But I think I was ready for it at that time.
It was an awakening within your heart of the seriousness that the church has an authority to speak on these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Up until then, you were saying, well, I can be a good Catholic and disagree.
Exactly. And it was the benefits of that in the church that I was going to, and the priests that we were being exposed to, and the environment of the people that we were in that really kind of gave that support to go forward. I remember telling Father Bart that when it would happen, if it ever came to happen, and it did, that the first thing I would do was say a Te Deum. And I don't remember what the Te Deum even was at the time, but when I went back, it was no greater day than the day that I went back for my first true confession in almost 20 years, where I could confess what I did, knowing full well that I was never going to do it again.
Wow. This HHS.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that concerns me about this is that, in a sense, you are kind of a witness to the fact that you could be a Catholic doctor all through the late 70s and 80s and 90s, and yet not be confronted on your weekly Mass with the wrongness of contraception.
Mm-hmm.
And yet now here we are fighting this battle
Mm-hmm.
against being forced to provide contraception. Yet for so many years, where was the voice?
Oh, I agree with you there. And even now, I think that some respects, and it's the message is being missed a little bit, because in my church, which is St. John's, where one would say it's a conservative church, that the priest gets up and talks about contraception, and people get up and leave. So it's really a scenario where the religious freedom is religious freedom to believe in the tenets of the church you're a member of, the Catholic Church, or it's religious freedom is to underscore the cafeteria. I have the freedom to believe whatever I want.
Yeah.
And that's the fear that I have going forward. And yes, you're right, because, in my perspective, when I left the field, that's when friends would come to me and say, I've been praying for this for years. Well, why didn't you tell me anything about it? The year before I did it, my daughter did a report on it, and she asked me if that's what I did, and I said yes. She said that's gross. There are people that would look at these situations and understand that there had to be something up about it, but by the same token, nobody really had ever come up to me and said, "Why are you doing this?" and be Catholic, or no one ever denied me communion or anything like that.
A priest that I knew early in my journey, with some tears, admitted to me when he was confronted on why. What happened was he heard a convert talk about becoming so convicted on these issues that the convert actually went and reversed his vasectomy.
Mm-hmm.
Because of what he realized. And the priest who had heard this had become so convicted why so many years he hadn't been teaching this. And he admitted it was because he was torn between wanting to be loved as the pastor. And so his idea of wanting to be loved was holding back on confronting them on things that he feared would divide them. Where he ended up, he said that the Sunday after he heard this, he was so convicted that that Sunday he preached Humana Vitae from beginning to end. And he said, I don't care. This is love. This is love, telling them the truth. And for so many years, you didn't hear it.
No, I didn't. And I hear it now from
Yeah.
the pulpit, from my church. I do, and I've come up against that as well as I do these talks, because there are some parishes that don't want to have anything to do with the talk because they're afraid it's going to divide their people. My experience, though, is as people begin to hear these voices, and it's not just Catholics, it's anybody, they begin to see what we're doing, and they begin to see the background. Because, people will always tell me that it's about I'm somehow against the children. I'm like, well, no, the children are gifts of God. It's got nothing to do with the children. It's all how they got to be. How are you going to describe to that child where they came from? And how are you going to describe that you put it off so long because you were trying to not to have children for so long?
What about the crazy statement now that the Catholic Church is robbing women of basic health care?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think that there's any Catholic woman who doesn't get basic health care. I don't think there's any woman who's not getting what they need when they need it and how they need it. I mean, by telling people that there's a modus of preventing pregnancy or encouraging pregnancy that requires people to take all these medicines that have their own effects, and somehow if I don't tell you that you shouldn't do that, I'm somehow affecting your basic health, or I'm beginning a war against women this way, or something like that. I just don't understand that. And I think good people, thinking people, anybody who looks at this just objectively has to say that where's the problem? There's not the problem people think. And I mean, we have no time but certainly there are so many things good reasons that people shouldn't be doing things that go beyond the theological. As a matter of fact, I don't really even feel qualified to talk about the theological. It's more the scientific, which is kind of amazing.
From a scientific standpoint.
Of course.
Would you agree that almost any doctor with an open mind from a scientific would affirm that life begins at conception?
Of course. I think that any doctor who looks at this objectively would say that. I mean, very briefly, I was actually invited to go to Costa Rica to help to defend that country, because in that country they don't allow in vitro fertilization, and in the Constitution of the Organization of American States it says that life begins at conception. So they were really trying to fight this against these other people, and what a great experience it was to meet these people, to see the life that they're trying to share there, and try to feed these people who really completely not from a theological basis are trying to push something that they think could harm their economy and harm their people. And honestly, there was a woman who wrote a paper about the embryo, who's a neurobiologist in Utah, who wrote the most clear, concise, scientifically based argument for life beginning at conception that I had ever read, and encourages me even now.
Yeah. We have an email. Xavier from Missouri writes, the other day some friends and I were talking about couples who want to have children but suffer from infertility. A girl who is a committed Catholic didn't understand why the Catholic Church condemns in vitro fertilization, and wondered if it's the only way a couple can get pregnant, then what is the difficulty? If it is the only way, then what's the difference? Isn't it unfair to the couple to deny them an effective way to conceive a child? What would be a good way to respond to her comments?
Well, the first question is have they really found out the reasons why you couldn't conceive? I mean, what's been lost as in vitro fertilization has become so much more part of the culture is the basic workup, diagnosis, and treatment of infertility. So if that hasn't been done, that probably should be done. But let's assume everything's normal and they've tried for a period of time and they just can't conceive. Well, I can make one argument, one forward I'll get to, but realistically first, what did we do before 1978 when the first IVF baby was born? Well, back then we had couples that could get pregnant, who couldn't get pregnant, and lived and adopted children, which is its own issue. or live childless. And I know it sounds terrible to say that there are couples that really probably God has deemed them to live childless, but that's God's will, if that's what that is. Now, on the other side of it is this: if I can get you people pregnant with in vitro fertilization, and it's not because of any other reason except, say, for unexplained infertility, then what would say that over time you couldn't get pregnant yourself? Because eventually those same situations would come forward. And I'm not saying that I don't want to be trite and say that it's people are just impatient. That's not it at all. But the point is, with time, God's will comes to fruition for everybody, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what we have to look for.
Yeah, this issue of accepting God's will for your life, especially if it doesn't match what you want. I mean, that's part of our spiritual journey. Mm-hmm. We live in a country where celibacy is not considered normal. So anybody considered who wants to live their life a celibate life because they believe God's calling them, whether they be a priest or a layman, well, God calls men and women to celibate life.
Exactly.
But our culture has rejected that. And as a result, we have thousands of aberrant lifestyles for people to have every kind of imaginable connection other than the valid connections, the craziness of the options that are out there.
Of course, and I even tell people as I'm talking, there are two issues out there that are simple. The first is that people get married so much older now than they did before. And I'm not saying that people need to go back and get married at 18, but 28, 29 is probably a little bit late to get started if you're looking to have 5 kids. That's just the way that's going to be. And that's the one side. And the other side is it's an interesting phenomenon that the Census Bureau actually came out with, that before 1970, nobody had their first child at the age or beyond the age of 35. Everybody had their children in their 20s. And that's a big change. And again, I'm not saying that we can put that genie back in the bottle or anything like that, but we have to think about that as a definite impact on these issues.
Yeah. Another email, Catherine from Cincinnati. A coworker of mine is Catholic and has been sharing a lot about her faith and with me. She even told me about this show. A lot of what she's telling me about Catholicism really makes sense. I'm having a hard time, though, with understanding the Catholic teaching on a few moral issues, specifically birth control and abortion. Is there some leeway here for personal convictions?
Again, that's that issue of God's will. I mean, we talk about personal convictions. We talk about I talk about getting behind the wheel of the bus. When you do that, something always seems to go wrong. It's just that when you open yourself up to God's will, sometimes it's a roller coaster. Sometimes it's wherever. And the reasons why the Catholic Church doesn't want or agree with birth control are based in the theological dogma that goes back to the time of Jesus Christ. And when you think about it I think there are a number of medical reasons that the birth control pill is a problem, not the least of which it can create a significantly increased risk of blood clots, and it does increase the risk of breast cancer, and not everybody can really take it effectively. And then what happens when you come off the pill? There are some people that will have enhanced fertility. There are a lot of people that don't. So yes, you have personal convictions, I guess, but as long as those personal convictions are lined up with Christ and with Jesus and with God's will, then my guess is that the answers to those questions will become self-evident.
Well, you're a unique witness to something and that is that even during the council, there was what everybody thought the church was going to say in a democratic way, and then the church stood its ground. Humanae Vitae, all these people thought, that the consensus was one direction. Paul VI stood his ground, and all these other things. And you were part of that.
You know what I'm saying?
I
grew up in there.
You were kind of a part of that, but it isn't democratic theology. Morality isn't decided by the most votes.
Right.
It's what's true.
It is really what's true. And I think that when you think about, again, it's not like the Catholic Church makes things arbitrarily. It does it from the natural law. And when you think about it from that perspective and learn about it, and that's the problem, we don't get taught about these things in school. You know what I mean? And honestly, it's hard. It's really hard to follow God's will. It's really, in my own world, I wonder why God doesn't do more. Why I can't open this office I want to open up. But it's on God's time, which is not our time. And if people can understand that, I always say, if more people would follow God's will, the world would be a much nicer place to live in.
Yeah. Well, that's called loving the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. I mean,
Right.
there's the key for us. And in the
Right.
medical field, it isn't you just deciding how do you answer that, but
Right.
it's listening
And,
to the
and,
truth.
and honestly, those are so easy things to say, but they're so difficult to live.
That's right. Dr. Caruso, thank you very much
Thank
for
you
sharing
very
your... If people wanted to contact you, is there a way?
Well, the easiest way is to go to my blog, which is www.chicagoinfertility.com.
All right.
St. Anne Center, STANNE Center.com, at Comcast.net. You can contact me directly. And that's really the easiest way to get in touch with me.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Caruso, for your witness. Continue to live your faith in your work. Thank you very much.
God bless you.
Thank you for joining us on this important edition of The Journey Home. Dr. Caruso, let's keep him in our prayers. He's fighting the good battles out there. God bless you. See you next week.